We'll come to order here. Good morning. And got some minutes. Somebody could move the minutes after you read them. We already read them, probably.
I read the minutes. I'll move the minutes.
Representative Claflin moves that the minutes to be approved from March 13, 2019. All in favor of that motion, say aye. Aye. Opposed? Minutes are approved. And our agenda today got House File 1700, the Marquart bill. Representative Marquart, welcome, and I will move that House File 1700 be referred to Ways and Means. So please tell us about the bill, Representative Marquart, and I see you got some testifiers too.
Very good. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair and members. And so House File 1700 is really an agreement between the MPCA and the MNDAC Farmers Cooperatives. Needless to say, the sugar beet industry is extremely important to not only the area along the Red River Valley and so forth, but in economically the state overall. And what this is, it has to do with the need or the not the need, I guess, to put in liners. And so I want to clarify here. At the processing plants where sugar beets are processed, like in Wahpeton, you have those ponds where you have the processed beets going into these water ponds. Those are lined. Those are lined. But there are areas that when the beets come off the field, they are put into a piling storage area before they then go to the factory. Those areas also have water runoffs. And basically that water runoff is rainwater and dirt. And so what this bill would say is that in those areas you would not be required to put a liner in these piling stations unless there would be some sort of significant determination that this was going to impact the groundwater. And the way that would work right now is that there's been an agreement that there would be something called a barrel test. I know my testifiers could be more specific on that. That would be constantly monitoring this. But for these co-ops to put in one of these liners are millions of dollars when in fact there probably is not a need for that. So I do have some testifiers here, Mr. Bruce Clevin, also Tom Knutson, who's with the MNDAC Farmers Cooperative, and they could have more details, Mr. Chair.
Please introduce yourself and proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. For the record, Bruce Clavin. I represent the MNDAC Farmers Cooperative on this bill. I have a 3-page handout that was prepared for you and sent around. I'll just walk you through that to give you a visual about what this bill talks about. First page, as Representative Marquart mentioned, that's the factory yard. It's an overhead view. You can see the ponds there. Those are wastewater ponds. They settle out the processed water, and those are lined. And this is on the North Dakota side of the river. So this is north of Wahpeton, a mile or two. You can see in the foreground there are 3 white sheds. Those are deep freeze sheds where the piles or the beets are brought in and piled, and then they're frozen during the winter. That allows the company to extend its processing season. You'll also see some brown piles, though. Those are in the process of being put in the factory for processing. On page 2, we have a picture of the growing area for the company. Those green squares are the townships where the members have acreage. The Red River is the squiggly yellow line down the middle that separates the company. The Gorder and Tyler stations are on the North Dakota side, and there are 5 on the Minnesota side. So that's the map. The reason those are spread out like that is to accommodate the harvest. The growers don't want to drive very many miles while they're harvesting. And so an average haul could be 8-10 miles. And so these are essentially collection points during the month of October. And those are where they are located on the map. And then the final page shows one of those piling sites. This is called the Lingas Receiving Station. It's named after the person who owns the land, and they rent that from him or her. And you can see there are 2 piling sites. The trucks come in during the fall, they go up on the piling sites, and they make these big piles. In the very corner, you'll see that little pond there. That's the collection pond. And those are the ponds the bill talks about. This would be considered a remote storage area. Water's collected in the end there. It's essentially rainwater, possibly some dirt, and there might be some beet tailings in there, which is organic matter. The issue came a couple years ago when the agency looked at a discharge, and we went back and forth about whether these ponds need to be lined or not. They are not lined right now, and some of them have been there since the factory was founded in 1974. 45 years some of these have been there without any problem. And so the conversation we had with them last spring was, before the growers should be required to line these, what if we find out if there's a problem first? And then if there's a problem, it would make sense to line them. The position by the agency a couple years ago was simply line all 5 on the Minnesota side. The North Dakota position was you don't have to line any. So the ones on the Minnesota side, the estimate was $9 million. And this is not corporate funds. Because this is a farmer cooperative, it would be out of the grower's pocket. And the cost on the North Dakota side was $0.00. So that's what led to the conversation. Folks from the agency are here if you have questions for them. Mr. Knutson is here as a resource for technical questions, but that's the issue in the bill before you, members.
Very good. I don't know if we'll go question here right away. I certainly can. Representative Guinea?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The significant impact on 1.10 is not defined. So the impact I might see is an impact on a neighbor's well. So I don't think you want to be in a position, or any of us be in a position of you're saving a whole bunch of money without some sort of guarantee to a neighbor that if their well is impacted, you would help out. Because a liner is, I understand that's very expensive, but helping out a neighbor whose well is impacted is not that, relatively speaking, is not that expensive. So it does seem that that's a missing piece in this legislation.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Guinea, one of the characteristics of the valley is when the Lake Agassiz Glacier cut it. It's mostly clay lined underneath in the valley, and so there's going to be a barrier between this pond and the groundwater naturally with the clay liner that already exists in the valley. That's one of the arguments we made, is that the clay is already there. If you go to the Department of Ag's nitrogen rule, and we had a lot of discussions about that last year, the valley has been largely exempted from that rule because of there's no concern on the part of the department, at least for nitrate leaching. I don't know, Mr. Knutson knows if they've ever had a conversation with a neighbor who called up and said the well is contaminated. I don't think we've heard that in the 45 years the ponds have been there. That would be news to me if there is an issue with someone's well.
Representative Guinea?
Thank you. Well, if you're confident that there's clay underneath, that's good. We should put all our landfills out there. And if you're confident that neighbors aren't going to have a complaint, then it does seem to me that makes it even easier to put in some language to say that if a neighbor is impacted, if a neighbor's well is impacted, then you all would help out.
Mr. Chairman, I think that we can maybe look at that. I think the thing we'd have to look at is the sourcing, where it came from. If it came from the pond or 5 miles away, I don't know if we'd be able to determine the source. I know the issue you're talking about with private well owners and what the contamination source might be. We might have a causation question, and I don't know if the folks from PCA would have better knowledge about that than I do, but I think that would be possibly an issue. See Mr. Smith's approaching.
Please introduce yourself for the record.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members. Jeff Smith, I'm the Director of the Industrial Division at the Pollution Control Agency. Keep in mind that these facilities are heavily permitted. They've got many wastewater, they've got a wastewater permit that covers as well as air permits, heavily regulated. And this language applies to all of the beet sugar companies in the state of Minnesota. So not just to Mindak, it applies to everybody. Part of the process that we would go through is evaluating to determine if there are going to be potential impacts. We would look at nearby groundwater wells or private wells to see if there's a potential for that. And none of this language kind of prohibits the careful look that we must do before we decide that's an environmental problem or not.
Representative McGee.
Okay, I get all that, but I'm just saying, if everybody's so confident that it's not going to impact the neighbor, and these are, not just next door to Wapaton, not just in the Breckenridge area. If they're in other areas, it does seem that we should make some provision for folks whose wells are contaminated through no fault of their own. So that would be my only hesitation about this bill.
A couple other members have questions here. We'll go down the list. Representative Lewitt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I want to get a little bigger perspective on, while this obviously, it's brought this attention, here's a specific circumstance with an operating plant and surrounding producers, but how big is the sugar beet industry and the processing plants on a regional basis? Not obviously, right away we talk about, well, which side of the river you're on in Dakota. Or, what are we talking about here from a more regional perspective as to the size and scope of the industry here? I'm not sure. I'm sure there's probably three people can answer that question. They're all smiling.
Well, thank you, Representative Lewick, and Mr. Clevin could probably give you more of the statistical details, but I know just in my school district of Dilworth, Lynn, and Felton, we have a number of sugar beet farmers, and as the sugar beet economy goes, so goes the school district and a lot of the other things that involve our economy. It is really huge. And, to that point, a report just came out Monday from the University of Minnesota Extension Office that the income for farms in the state of Minnesota is at its lowest point, the lowest income since they started to keep data in 23 years. And many are estimating the income, inflation adjusted, is as low as back into the 1980s. And it's been 6 years in a row with declining income. And so a bill like this is, and certainly Representative Wagenius, understand your concerns, but here, if Mindak, for example, just this one example, was required to spend $9 million putting in liners, when you basically have rainwater, you have dirt and some beet tailings, with really no indication that this is going to have an impact on groundwater, that is really hitting an economy that is already in very tough shape. And so I think this agreement is very reasonable, and you've heard, folks from the PCA talk about this industry is already heavily permitted. They're looking at this continually, and I just think sometimes you have an overkill that just is very detrimental to the realities of things and to a very important industry.
Representative Lewitt.
I guess if I could follow up a little bit, and this would go more to that, obviously the permitting situation for those plants, and a lot of folks don't understand that a permit over here on whether it's a cattle feeding operation or a processing plant literally reaches back all the way to that first line producer. What happens with everything at that particular site is probably in some way under the cognizance of MPCA. And I guess, have we had any, hard and fast issues that we've saw where we can point and say this well was endangered or actually impacted, and I'm not talking about just that, but I'm, across the state. I mean, we pile corn, all kinds of stuff we have to do temporary stowage in the process of getting it even into an elevator, or sometimes we got stuff piled outside of the elevator. I mean, that's a pretty normal part of agriculture, of you don't like it, but you have to do temporary storage. But are we seeing a situation here, this looks like it's a good way to just make sure that you really got to have a problem before you run out there and try to correct it, I guess. So I'm looking at this, how big a problem is it? Do we really see it out there at this point?
Sure. Mr. Chairman, Representative Lewick, we haven't seen a problem directly that we know of related to the factory or the ponds. I think it should be noted here that the beets run on a 3-year rotation, ideally, possibly 4 if you have enough land base to cover it. This is a root crop, and so one thing you got to watch is root disease. So these crops in that growing area I showed you are going to be rotated for sure with beans, probably corn. Corn has gone farther north. It goes up to the Canadian border. So all of those will have nitrogen additives at some point as well. The soybeans, of course, operate the opposite. They'll take the nitrogen out, store it, or fix it in the soil. And so that's part of what I was getting at with Representative Venus' question is the causation part. There's more going on in the crop rotation.
Yeah.
But ideally, you want 3 years, 4 if you can get it.
Again, and I'm sure there's some more questions out there, but yeah, it would seem that this is a reasonable approach here to make sure, and I know our agencies are generally going to follow the law, and if there's a real legitimate problem, they're obviously going to deal with it. But this makes sure that you really got to have that legitimate problem absolutely documented before you hammer an industry, and particularly the fact that you just look at where the river is there and the potential there if you force one portion of that industry to do something and it's certainly not warranted, you're literally going to destroy that element of sugar beet agriculture on that side of the river. It's just that simple. And so there needs to be insurance here that our agencies proceed with absolute caution, and if there's a problem, absolutely, they're going to go in and make it and have it corrected. But yeah, considering the situation with the across the board in agriculture where we're at, we don't need to add that kind of concern to the folks out there trying to make a living in agriculture right now that, oh my gosh, now am I going to get tipped over here because what's going to happen to a stowage situation? I mean, it's no joke. People lose the whole farm over that type of stuff because they look and I mean, we're trying to help some of the stress out there with adding resources for mental health services. And so this is a good way to send a signal that, hey, we'll fix problems, but let's make sure that we approach them in a very, very careful and clear manner. So again, I don't want to belabor the point, but I'm sure that probably a few other folks maybe have questions too.
Good. Representative Bolonek.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do have a couple of questions. Question number one, we're not looking at processed water, and I'd be a lot more concerned if we were. In this case, we're looking at storage water. And so in my mind, that's likely just going to be the same as surface water running off after a rain event and that sort of thing. But it makes me wonder, has the state ever sampled the water that's in those ponds? You know, is it just dirt and you know, a little organic material, kind of the same stuff you're going to find as surface water running off after the rain event? I can't imagine there's a lot of other materials coming off.
Yeah, let's, yeah.
Say your name again there and proceed. Did you hear the question okay?
I did. Mr. Chair, members, thank you. Jeff Smith, Director of the Industrial Division at the Pollution Control Agency. The pollutant we're primarily concerned with would be the nutrients, nitrogen specifically, that would be coming off of those waste piles, and that potential impact to the groundwater. And it's it's accurate to say that there's many of these remote pile sites all over the state from the 3 major beet sugar companies, and they are all very, very different. I think that's one of the things that we're considering here is that there are some that have ponds, there are some that just run off naturally to surface waters, some are land applied, some have other BMPs around those storage sites to make sure that the stormwater is not discharging directly to a surface water, a ditch, or a river, or some other surface water. So trying to say that one of these, it looks like the other one is very different. I think we're acknowledging the fact that it does take us a good hard look at each one of these sites to determine whether it needs to have a stormwater pond to collect that waste material or that waste water. It is primarily stormwater, but it does contain nutrients and sediment. So that's what we're concerned about. Part of our process is to do that specific review on each one of these pond sites. Some of these pond sites, many of them do have lined ponds, and that's because we've determined through our evaluation based on proximity to drinking water wells or surface waters or other areas of risk that putting in a lined pond liner is the right way to go. And the companies, in our experience, have been very willing to do that when we can show that the risks are high. And there are other places where there is no risk. We've got a good clay liner, as Mr. Clavens indicated, and the risks are very, very low. So in those situations, lining that pond would not be, it's expensive and would not be necessary to ensure protection of the groundwater.
Thank you, Mr.
Representative
Chair.
Bowe.
Does the risk of nitrogen leaching out of the stored beets increase over time? And if so, what kind of period of time are we looking at, and how long are the beets usually stored? Because I notice it mentions temporary storage, so I'm trying to wrap my head around timeframes here.
Mr. Smith.
Mr. Chair, members, yes, I think that's an important consideration. These are remote storage sites. The beets are there for no more than, I think, a season, for a few weeks to a few months. So they are not there for a long period of time. If they were there for a longer period of time, we would have more concern because it would be collecting and leaching, and the potential runoff would be of a higher strength. So the fact that these are remote and temporary sites is an important factor.
Mr. Chair, one more, please.
Representative Bowe.
Thank you. It mentions that a risk assessment will be done, and I'm curious, number one, what does that entail? And number two, who's the responsible party for making that risk assessment?
Mr. Smith.
Mr. Chair, members, that risk assessment includes some of the things I've mentioned, a review of the depth of groundwater, the BMPs around the site, proximity to surface waters, how long the beets have been there, how many beets, what kind of tonnage are we talking about. Those sorts of locational aspects are important when we think about that assessment. We usually work very closely with the company. We ask them to provide that information, and then we review it carefully and make that assessment whether they need to do some other BMPs to make sure that groundwater won't be impacted, or ultimately if the installation of a liner would be important.
So you're asking sorry, Mr. Chair. So you're asking like the cooperative or the farmers to do that and gather that information and submit it to the PCA, and then the agency makes a decision?
Mr. Smith.
Mr. Chair, members, the company would do that. We're not working directly with the farmers at all,
Okay.
so it's directly with the company.
Thank you.
Representative Gomez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, most of my questions Representative Bowe asked. I just wonder if you know how many sites like this there are across the state?
Mr. Smith.
Mr. Chair, members, I would say dozens. I can get that exact number if that would be helpful. Yep, I can.
Dozens is good. I just didn't even really have an idea of the scale of it. I appreciate that. And so the risk assessment of each of these sites, you talked about sort of like reviewing each pond, evaluating, or even like whether a waste pond is necessary. And I'm just wondering how much of is the risk assessment part of the permitting for water and air that you do as a matter of course with these farms, or would the risk assessment be like a additional kind of step that is required by this legislation?
Mr. Smith.
Mr. Chair, members, it's part of our normal wastewater permit process. We look at the bigger ponds that are closer to the facility, the processing facility, the ones that are lined and carry the majority of the processed wastewater. But we do, every time we go through a permit renewal, we do ask about those remote storage sites, and we do ask the questions that lead us to understand the risks associated with those sites.
Okay, thank you very much.
Representative Fabian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Smith, how often are permits renewed?
Mr. Smith.
Mr. Chair, members, every 5 years, unless they are making a change, an expansion of the project, then we would, if it requires a permanent amendment, then we would do that modification.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So give me an example of a typical modification or a change in a permit that would be asked for in a remote piling station, say in Humboldt, Minnesota.
Mr. Smith.
Mr. Chair, members, so if they're going to add on a new remote site, that might not require a full-blown review or reissuance of their current wastewater permit. The company would submit that to us. We would review that based on that specific instance. It's when they're doing an expansion that would be, they'd be discharging more wastewater, for instance, that would trip that need for a full-blown review of their wastewater permit, including that public comment period and public notice.
Representative Fabian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So Representative Marquart, Chair Marquart, I want to thank you for bringing forward this Fabian Marquart bill, as we heard in your committee earlier this morning. Members, this is a common sense bill, okay? When you come up to my district and you talk to the, not just the sugar beet growers, but all kinds of growers, they just feel like they are under attack by the PCA. And we've had these conversations before. Fugitive dust at a canola crushing plant. You can only dump so many tons per day out of a end dump truck, but you can bring in basically an unlimited number of belly dump trucks. And anybody who knows the difference between them, the farmers that I know, they just shake their head at the really unreasonableness of so much of what's going on. And come on out there, ride up with me this weekend, and talk to the farmers in the coffee shops and the gas stations. They just feel like the state of Minnesota is constantly looking for a way to make their lives more difficult. Not necessarily willfully, but it is. And Representative Marquart, this is so much common sense. Members, sugar beets are growing in the ground. And the things that we're talking about coming off of these piles is the stuff that's coming from the ground. Now, whether it's happening here or 100 yards to the left of where the piling station is, it's all on the ground. Rain is coming down on the ground and something is happening. Some of it runs off and some of it percolates down into the soil. So the idea that this is causing some sort of major impact for the people that I represent is somewhat preposterous. These growers are members of a co-op. The ag economy, as everybody knows right now, is in a very, very difficult position. And adding one more layer of bureaucracy, one more layer of costs, because that's who this is going to come from. It's going to come from the growers. It's not going to be able to be passed on to the consumers. It's going to come from the growers, the individual farmers, who quite frankly live in rural Minnesota. And where do they get their drinking water from? From the ground underneath their homestead. That's where it comes from. And I just think that, you know, in the last session when this issue started to come forward, I asked for data from MPCA on what's going on out there. And I have yet to receive that. So I don't know what problem we're actually trying to solve. And Representative Marquart, thank you to you for standing up for farmers and agriculture. We're looking for friends and allies in year one, and I appreciate what you're doing here today. The sugar beet industry and agriculture is the backbone of the economy in the Red River Valley and rural Minnesota. The next thing you know, we're going to go up on northern Minnesota, and we're going to start doing the same things maybe at the mills where they make paper and lumber. and they have piling areas where the trees are stored. You know, the timing couldn't be worse in the ag community as far as I'm concerned, to start increasing costs for them. Another thing that's going to happen as a result of these types of things is I've heard lots of people express concerns about farms getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. This is just one more thing that's going to cause family farms to suffer another hardship that's going to make farms bigger. Our family farms are extremely important. You know, this is the backbone of our school districts. Thank you for the work you're doing with the ag credits and so forth, trying to make the tax that farmers pay better. Members, this is so much common sense here that I'm almost at a loss for words, which is hard for me to admit, but I certainly hope that we can move this bill forward. And Mr. Chair, can you remind me, I apologize, I had to step out just for a minute at the beginning. What's the motion on this bill?
To go to Ways and Means.
Oh, good. I'd love to have this debate on the House floor. So anyway, I'm just looking through my notes here to make sure I've got my stuff covered that I wanted to talk about. I don't really have that many questions. I just want to stand up for the farmers in the district and the economy. And thank you again, Representative Marquart. And thanks to the good things that the beet growers do and all the growers do. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Representative Hanson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Representative Marquart or Mr. Clavin. It seems that the discussion is either an either-or discussion. Either we do what we've been doing for 45 years or we do this plastic liner thing. And it seems that, you know, the creativity and the problem solving that we've had to deal with elsewhere in the state, when I look at the map there or look at the photo, I was thinking about what the stormwater ponds that we've had to have throughout the metro, and we've tried replacing those with rain gardens or some type of biofiltration to deal with them. And I know on a large scale, there's been the Red Path project and other projects in northwestern Minnesota. And it would seem to me maybe there's a third way here of dealing with these things that would be maybe more ecologically sound, but also cheaper. Because I'm fully aware you've got 200 feet of clay, and it's probably not groundwater, it's probably surface water and holding, and just like stormwater ponds here, you may be concentrating materials there that then build up. We didn't think stuff would build up in the stormwater ponds here, but it did. And so by having biofiltration or doing some type of a different way of doing those ponds might be something that would solve both problems. And so I don't know if anything's been looked at there. You know, it might be a more sound way of dealing with water storage. And I know the other big projects, the water storage is designed to hold it and then have it disappear later on and actually even be farmed. So I see these as almost giant stormwater ponds that maybe could use the same type of biofilter settling and solution that we've been trying. And maybe that's something that could be worked out to even try it as one and see if it works. I mean, we keep going back to either you're for or against something, or you either love the environment or love farmers, and there's no way in between. And it seems to be that we could try something else here to be more creative and see if it has some type of solution rather than just yes or no. And that's kind of a larger observation, and just wondering what you think of that.
So, Mr. Chair.
Representative Marquardt.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair and Representative Hanson. And I don't know what's all dealt with a biofilter and so forth, but I do think the strength of this bill is that it is not a one-size-fits-all. I mean, there may be a time, as Mr. Smith talked, that you would need a liner of some sort, but you're going to look at each kind of situation differently, which could go ultimately to something you're talking about. And that's important. You know, even when we were talking about the nitrogen rule last year, the first maps that came out had basically the entire state that had to abide by all this. And then when they looked at things more, they noticed that the Northwest and that with the clay that basically was taken out of the map. And so many times the state has kind of taken this one size approach, the either or type of thing. And I think the strength of this bill really is probably getting to where you're going a little bit, or at least would allow that, Representative Hansen, where it would allow the MPCA to work with like cooperatives and so forth to determine what might be the best way to do that. But for sure, what we don't want is just automatically, where there's this requirement, you have to put in a liner at millions of dollars when there is not a real immediate, I guess, research or whatever behind it that would show that it's needed.
Very good. Representative Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question for Mr. Clavin on the third page of the photos here. That beet pile in the foreground, there's a bunch of little black things along the side of that pile. What are they?
Mr. Chairman, for Bruce Clavin again. Those are culverts, essentially. They're round galvanized pipes. Those are for ventilation. Okay, so every few feet when the pile's being made, these piles are made over a 2 to 3 week period in October. That's the harvest season. As the pile moves and the pile goes back, put in the ventilation. When the temperature gets 5 below, they throw the fans on and freeze the pile solid. Representative Lewick asked about the impact earlier. This is one of the reasons why Minnesota is #1 in beet production, is because we have a natural refrigerator outside. California, not so much. So they throw the fans on and these piles turn rock solid. What happens then is allows the factory to process into the spring. And so those are the ventilation tubes that get put in, to answer your question.
Representative Anderson.
Mr. Clavin, again, another question about the actual harvest. If the temperature gets too hot in October, does harvest have to shut down?
Mr. Clavin.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative Anderson, yes. So in order for these beets to store in this pile, you have to have a root temperature that's not too cold or not too hot. And so we always have a challenge during harvest time. If it gets into the 60s or 70s, they have to stop because you can't put a beet in a pile that's hot. If you do, it'll start to spoil. The beet actually, because it's a sucrose-based product, and there's a crown coming out, basically the top of his head, the solar panels, when you cut those off, the beet realizes that it's injured. So when it goes in the pile, it spends its own sugar to try to heal itself because it tells itself in the pile, I have to grow new leaves out of the top. And when it expends the sugar, it makes a hot spot, and then it starts to spoil the pile. So you don't want it to go in too hot because it'll accelerate that process. You also can't put them in when they've frozen. So if the temperature one night in October gets below 27 degrees, give or take, starts to be frosty, you have to stop again. Because if you put a frozen beet in, the frozen beet will immediately try to heal itself. So this is the window we work in addition to all the other stuff, because we have to manage that, and Tom at the factory, he's VP of Ag, he has to make sure that these piles don't have problems.
Representative Anderson.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. A good explanation in the point being that these piles have to be picked up before spring when it warms up again. They're taken out during the winter. So again, it's temporary storage, and they're not there in the spring when we get heavier rains and such, and the piles are cleaned up and done in a way that is a good common sense way. And again, because of the heat limitations and such, these are picked up before spring. And again, as Representative Fabian said, this is a common sense solution to the situation for piling beets.
I have Representative Heinzman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This might have been brought up earlier, but I could have missed it. Representative Marquart, this bill, if I understand correctly, was passed last session and was vetoed. What was the impact of that over the course of the last year or so? And you could elaborate a little bit on kind of where people are at currently and their expectations.
Representative Martin.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I'll have Mr. Clevin ask that. As far as Representative Heinzman, I don't know if I quite understand your question. You're saying in the year since this, what might have been what happened in this situation? Maybe Mr. Knutson or Mr. Clay can be more specific.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Heinzman, the agency really acted as though it had passed. They went right to work saying, let's do the risk assessment and start the process as though it had passed. So we would want to credit them to that extent. They didn't wait and say, put in the liners. They said, let's get started on it.
Representative Heinzman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So to that point, what would happen if this bill didn't pass this session? Would that continue going forward in perpetuity, or at some point would there be a sort of a line in the sand where we're going to be taking a completely different course, and there may be I'm assuming, a more drastic impact in Representative Marquart's community?
Mr. Chairman, yeah, Representative Heinzman, hard to speculate on what would happen. The current folks we're working with right now, Mr. Smith and the others, want to do the barrel test and see where it goes. I don't know what future administrations would do. We wanted to put it in statute, belt and suspenders, I guess. But we wanted to put it in so that everybody knew, and then going forward, if you're going to put a pond in, if you're going to expand, they're going to do a risk assessment before they permit it for any future construction.
Representative Heinzman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I heard earlier in testimony that some of these ponds have been in place for as much as 50 years.
Mr. Chairman, I think our knowledge is maybe 45. This factory in Wapton was put in 74, give or take, plus the years of construction. One of the ponds went in that first year. So 2019 is 45 years would probably be the most.
Representative Heinzman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So over that period, which 45 years sounds like quite a long time, Representative Wagenius was talking about wells in the area that may be affected going forward. I'm wondering, have we got information relative to wells that could have been impacted in the last 45 years? What does that look like? And have we seen, looks like we got a testifier coming down here.
Mr. Smith.
Mr. Chair, members, Jeff Smith again. So I'm not aware of any wells that have been impacted by nitrates specifically from the discharge to the groundwater from these ponds. Part of our process is to, as I said, to look at those that represent the highest risk. And when we've done that in the past, these facilities have been permitted for decades and decades. That's the situation where, because the risk was relatively high or higher, that we've required the facilities to install a liner in that pond. And so part of our process is to do that risk assessment. Even absent this bill, that has been our ongoing process, to look at the highest risk ponds or storage sites first, and then make adjustments to permit requirements that would accommodate the need for us to do a more regulatory look at those risky ponds.
Representative Heinzman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm assuming that we have pretty detailed information as to what private wells are in the potentially affected area. I'm not trying to minimize if that number is small or exaggerate if the number is high. I'm just wondering how many potentially are we testing and looking at currently, and how many could be possibly affected going forward? If you don't have that information off the top of your head, that's okay, but I would like to better understand the area, I guess, that is impacted and where that flow is going. Those that could be in the crosshairs, so to speak, potentially, although I'm hearing that up until this point, 45 years, and we haven't had a single well that we know to be impacted. Is that correct?
Mr. Smith.
Mr. Chair, members, I don't have that information in front of me. I couldn't say whether there has been a well that has been impacted. Department of Health kind of manages the drinking water wells, the data around that, so we certainly could try to pull some of that information together to provide you that data. Again, this is dozens and dozens of sites, and they are all very, very different. The ones that involve the larger ponds that we're describing here that are lined, there's maybe a dozen of those or 15 of those across the state through the 3 large beet sugar companies, but there are dozens and dozens of smaller ones that may not have ponds And they don't need ponds because the runoff is already being incorporated, or there are BMPs around the sugar beet pile to maintain the water from running off or leaching off. So it's hard to say based on the number of these storage sites, and they change regularly too. There are other companies will decommission a site and then begin a new site based on the needs of the farmers.
Representative Heinzman?
So in these photos, and we may be switching back and forth between testifiers, we see a facility that is potentially going to be impacted with facilities on both the Minnesota and North Dakota side, if I heard correctly. If this legislation becomes law, are we talking about a half a dozen or all facilities that could potentially be benefiting from this legislation? How many of these do we know to be affected if this law was passed?
Mr. Smith?
Mr. Chair, members, as I said, there's across the three major beet sugar companies in the state of Minnesota, there are literally dozens and dozens of these beet sugar remote storage sites. I would need to do quite a detailed analysis of our data to be able to sort of parse out how many will be the larger ones with existing ponds versus those that are just smaller and don't represent the kind of risks that, you know, a larger storage site might involve.
That's one,
Representative
Mr. Chair.
Heinzman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Assuming then, with dozens and dozens of sites, that we're taking samples and we're looking at potentially, what, hundreds or thousands of wells in the impacted areas currently, and still have not yet seen a single impact? I just want that on the record and clarified if I could.
Mr. Smith?
Mr. Chair, I can't speak to whether there has been any well, private wells that have been impacted by by runoff or leaching from these sites. There may have been, I'm just not aware of any. But based on part of the process that we go through, that is a consideration that we will certainly look at. If we're seeing well problems at a private well, we'll begin to look at, and in conjunction with the Department of Health, why that well is impacted. It may not be this particular runoff or this particular site. Wells around, private wells around the agricultural areas all over the state of Minnesota, not even in proximity to these beet sugar temporary storage sites, have been and are impacted by ag runoff. It's often difficult to attribute that impact to a specific source, like a remote beet storage pile.
Representative Wagenius?
Thank you. Just a quick follow-up on Representative Gomez asked about the risk assessments that you're doing, and you mentioned you were looking for nitrogen. The Department of Ag has shown us that where there's nitrogen, there are pesticides. So I have two questions. Are you looking at pesticides when you do these risk assessments?
Mr. Smith?
Mr. Chair, members, indirectly, yes. I think when we're seeing high levels of nutrients like nitrogen, we're also assuming some pesticides are tagging along for the ride, as you will. So it is I don't know that we're doing specific testing for pesticides, but again, if we're seeing a significant nutrient runoff or impact or potential impact to groundwaters, putting in liners where that's appropriate is to take care of both a nutrient and a potential pesticide problem.
If I could just,
Representative, real quick if we can, we got two more bills there.
okay. So for a family that has a well that's contaminated, I would be worried for the children more about the pesticides than the nitrates. I was just a comment. I wasn't aware that the Department of Health had done any checking up on wells in outstate Minnesota. So it would be, if you would follow up and let us know about that, that would be important.
Look for some follow-up from you, then, Mr. Anderson, on that. Representative Lewis?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I guess this would be for Mr. Smith. In the process of working with the various permits that surround a sugar beet plant or any of the, major processing plant. Do you have any estimate of about how many pages of rules and protocol and general guidance that the MPCA follows? Just a ballpark? Do you count it in pages or do you count it in volumes, depending on what it is? Just a ballpark idea?
I'm just gonna ask
Yeah.
if you can give something real quick, and then we're gonna move on here, so.
Mr. Chair, members, it's extensive.
I agree. But the reason I asked that question is, folks, we need to back up here, and what Representative Marquart is asking is to put 2 more really simple sentences in that huge framework of guidance that the agency uses when they go about dealing with these issues. And I mean, I think this makes sense. It simply provides a very specific path if in fact there's a potential issue out there with a pollutant or contamination. And so I'm really skeptical, Mr. Chair, about putting even a single word of new stuff in statutes, because we usually spend years trying to correct it. But here's 2 simple sentences that really more than pass the common sense test, and I would hope the agency would welcome that kind of pretty straightforward guidance on here's what we do if we run into something like this. So with that, I mean, I really think this makes sense, and ought to just whistle right through here to the register if possible, after it bounces through Ways and Means.
If Representative Lewis, if we don't talk it to death, I think we're gonna get it there, so. Representative Anderson, real quick, please.
Yeah, very quick, Mr. Chair. MnDAC's in a unique situation doing business in 2 states, and I would just ask somebody from MnDAC if situations such as this, permitting or piling stations and such, in realizing that you put these in strategic locations, does this impact at all your decisions in where you locate these things in terms of where you may or may not have more regulation to follow up?
Please say your name and then
Sure.
proceed.
Tom Knudsen, I'm the Vice President of Agriculture for MnDAC Farmers Co-op. The question was, as I understood it, based on the permitting requirements between the 2 states, would it impact how we would do business going forward? Probably somewhat. It's not a one-size-fits-all, and why I say that is because, as Bruce Clevin mentioned earlier, these sites are located where the sugar beet acreage and fields are to minimize the travel distance for delivery. And 70% of our acreage is in Minnesota, 30% in North Dakota. That's why you see 5 facilities on the Minnesota side on remote and 2 facilities on the North Dakota side. I can tell you anecdotally, and it probably won't make a lot of friends in this room, but the reason the factory was located in Wahpeton, North Dakota in 1974 might have had something to do with the difference between operating parameters in the 2 states. But that was before I was involved, so.
Real quick, please. President Faber.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, real quickly, I just want to point out that it's not unique necessarily, because American Crystal Sugar is located on both sides of the river as well. And what's going on in the ag sector today compared to when I was a kid and we were driving a 40/20, I didn't think it could get any better. And with the variable rate applicators and GPSs and soil sampling and plant uptake and plant science and uptake of nutrients and so forth, farmers are doing a great job of minimizing nutrient application and pesticides. So thank you for the good work you're doing.
Comments, Representative Marquardt.
Well, Mr. Chair and members, thanks so much for the conversation, discussion here. Appreciate all of it. This bill is just a practical approach to protecting the groundwater, but also making sure we're not putting unnecessary burdens and costs on farmers. So thank you so much for your consideration.
Thank you, Representative Marquardt. I'll renew my motion that House File 1700 be referred to Ways and Means. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Aye, opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
And we're going to look at House File 1327 next. Representative Fischer. we're changing up just a little bit here, but we got to understand we've got a number of testifiers on this bill, so.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, Committee. I appreciate the opportunity to present House File 1327 today. I understand this is an informational hearing, and I do have several testifiers here, so I appreciate the opportunity to move along. Would you like me to start with the presentation, sir?
Please, would you?
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair, Committee. The bill I have before you, House File 1327, is in some ways very simple, straightforward bill. What it basically does is puts into statute that there will be no open season for wolves. So basically what that means is we're focusing on that there will be no recreational or trophy hunting of the wolf here in Minnesota. One of the things I want to make very clear on as we're establishing this is that this bill does nothing to stop or prevent the efforts that are out there to protect the livestock of farmers. I want people to be aware of the fact that a number of years ago that we did have a open season on wolves. And what's interesting is when we had that open season on wolves, the wolf population went down by about 25%. But during that time, the increase in livestock and wolf conflicts the following year after the wolf hunt, where the wolves went down by 25%, the conflicts went up by 25% because of the dynamics that happened as a wolf pack was disrupted. And so my testifiers will hit on that issue. The other thing that I would like to point out very clearly is that in 2017, there were 89 verified complaints of wolves attacks here in the state that killed 77 cattle. And in response, the responses out there were able to take 199 wolves to protect the farmers and the livestock out there. And so first of all, I want to make it very clear that this is just addressing the recreational hunt, that the methods that are out there to protect farmers and their livestock would still be in place and would not be in jeopardy. I do know that there may be disagreements on both sides, whether we have a recreational or trophy hunt of the wolves, and that's part of the reason why we're going to have the discussion today, is to be able to have this opportunity to hear both sides of the argument. The other thing I'd like us to keep in mind is that many people value the wolf very greatly. It's also held in high regard by a number of our native population here in the state where they consider it a sacred animal. And that's also one of the things that I hear about from time to time from people in my district, is that we should be helping protect the wolf because of that status. With that, I'd like to turn it over to my testifiers because I know that we have a limited amount of time today.
If I may, Representative Fischer, I'm understanding that the DNR has somebody here to give testimony, and we wanted to get them on the record real quick.
Certainly.
And then we'll go with testifiers from the audience. And just so committee knows, we do have this room till 12:30, I'm advised, so.
We have session at noon.
We have session today.
Well, we'll try and be done. Please.
Mr. Chairman, members, for the record, Bob Meyer, Assistant Commissioner, and I have with me Dan Stark, our big game expert. We just want to provide a little background on the actual wolf delisting, the process that's going forward right now, and the wolf population and management to date in Minnesota. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan Stark.
Please introduce yourself for the record.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Dan Stark. I'm the large carnivore specialist for the Department of Natural Resources.
Proceed.
Minnesota's wolf population was at its lowest point in the 1950s, estimated to be about 400 to 700 wolves. By the time they were listed under the Endangered Species Act in 1974, they were estimated to be about 700 to 1,000 wolves. And in 1978, the DNR started conducting systematic surveys of the wolf population, and at periodic intervals estimated the wolf population initially at every 10 years, more recently has been doing annual population estimates. In 1978, the population was estimated to be about 1,250 wolves. And since that time, it grew pretty rapidly in number and distribution throughout the northern third of the state. And the current estimate is 2,655 wolves. The wolf population estimates are conducted in the winter months. This is when the population is the most stable. And it's also the best time of the year to observe wolves because of the snow on the ground, the lack of tree canopy, so we can observe wolves from a plane and get estimates of pack size and track those packs throughout the winter months to get locations to determine the territory. And those are kind of the two key components that we use of wolf biology to estimate our wolf numbers. This methodology has been published in peer-reviewed journals and has been a consistent methodology that the DNR has used throughout the time that it's been conducting these surveys. Science supports the conclusion that the wolf population in Minnesota has recovered. The state's current estimate is 2,655 wolves, and the wolf population in Minnesota has exceeded the recovery criteria for several decades. Just transitioning a little bit to the current news on the federal legal status for wolves. On March 15th, 2019, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service proposed a rule to delist wolves throughout the lower 48 states, essentially removing Endangered Species Act protections for wolves in Minnesota and the other 47 states. This is a proposed rule. There's a 60-day public comment period where members of the public as well as agencies are allowed to comment on that proposal. It could be extended to include a time frame for public hearings, but the current deadline for comments is May 14th. The service has until March 15th, 2020 to either finalize the rule or withdraw the action. And so the time frame in which wolves may, or endangered species protections may be removed for wolves could be at that time or following the publication of the final rule. I have nothing further.
I want to get the testifiers in before we go to any questions, so let's start bringing testifiers forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before that, could we have DNR explain what the process is currently, if it were to be delisted, what statutes currently are on the books?
Yeah, with some brevity here, we got a lot of folks who want to testify on this, so.
Mr. Chairman, for the record, again, Bob Meyer, Assistant Commissioner. Actually, 97B.645 Subdivision 9 provides the process that we would need to follow before we'd be able to establish any management activities, at least by the DNR. That states there shall be no open season for wolves until after the wolf is delisted under the Federal Endangered Species Act of 1973. After that time, the Commissioner may prescribe open seasons and restrictions for taking wolves, but must provide opportunity for public comment. If and or when this will ever take place at the federal level, the DNR will take public comment. There is no time period here, but we'd make sure that that public comment period is long enough to get the comments we need, and also engaged in a thorough tribal consultation process with each of the 11 Minnesota bands as well.
Very good. Okay. Let's go to our Representative Lewis.
I just want to make sure that, you know, obviously our folks from the DNR stay here, because we've already heard some interesting speculation on how the wolf population varies from year to year from the author, and I do know that there's probably the best level of data on, at least in the lower 48, on the wolf populations held by Mr. Stark and Mr. Meyer. So I just want to make sure that they get an opportunity to answer questions about the real history on the wolf population throughout the state of Minnesota. They've just touched on it, but there's a lot more there.
We'll be right over there.
Thank you for that. We're trying not to shortchange anybody here, so bring our Representative Fischer, the first testifier. And well, while I'm at it here, other testifiers, please move to the area behind the testifying chairs there so that we're ready to rock and roll here so we can keep going.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members. My name is Joseph Wolf believe it or not, WOLF. I have followed, of course, the fate of the wolf for many years because of the name. It just wasn't of interest to me. I'm here today representing Howling for Wolves, an organization that advocates on behalf of wolves in the hopes that we may preserve the species for future generations. The first thing that we're going to talk about today is, in fact, some of the things that Mr. Stark mentioned. That is specifically the process by which the wolf population is estimated from year to year. Now, my background is as an environmental scientist and a measurement guy. I have been a measurement guy for about 50 years. And in that capacity for various clients, including the US EPA, my job was to make measurements, draw conclusions from those measurements, and make decisions based on those measurements. That's the reason I took an interest in the method that the DNR was using. And as a result, Howling for Wolves hired a statistical firm in Texas to do an analysis of the method. For lack of time, we simply reverse engineered the mechanisms that the DNR uses and were able to reproduce their results. It's a long paper, and so what we've done is we've created a video to try and explain it in as simple a terms as possible. And so we're going to start that right now, if I can do this right.
Have you ever wondered if we really know how many wolves live in Minnesota? Well, we don't know. Not exactly. The Minnesota DNR doesn't, and probably can't accurately count wolves or wolf packs. Instead, they produce a general wolf estimate based on bad science and flawed assumptions. And that's a real problem when dealing with a threatened species like the wolf. Here's how their estimate process works. Every 10 years, the DNR generally uses signs of wolves, such as sightings, scat, paw prints, and signs of predation, to determine which areas of Minnesota are occupied wolf territories. There are some places within these areas that are good wolf habitats, meaning good places for wolves to live. But in these areas, there are no signs of wolves. But since in the DNR's eyes it's a suitable habitat for wolves, they figure wolves are probably there anyway, like they should live there even if they don't. It's like assuming every apartment in a complex is full just because the building is in a great location. Hardly sound logic. In fact, 32% of the entire occupied wolf territory is assumed to have wolves living there even without any signs of wolves. So how does the DNR decide how many wolves might be in this occupied wolf territory? There are between 30 and 40 packs of wolves in the wild that have been collared and monitored by the DNR. Using these packs, the DNR estimates two things: an average number of wolves per pack and an average territory size per average pack. With these two averages, they return to the occupied wolf territory, and they see how many of these average territories they can fit inside the occupied wolf territory, regardless of whether or not there are signs of wolves there. For example, let's say the DNR says they can fit 500 average wolf territories into the total occupied wolf territory. So that's an estimated 500 packs. Then they multiply the number of packs, 500, by the average number of wolves per pack, let's say 4.5. Then the DNR will assume there are about 2,250 wolves in the occupied wolf territory, and that's with a margin of error of plus or minus 500 wolves. They're saying we have somewhere between 1,750 and 2,750 wolves. That's a 1,000 wolf difference. If that number seems significant, it's because that's a big difference. And most alarming is that this way of estimating wolf numbers has never been proven to tell if and in what areas the estimates match real wolf numbers. Beyond the questionable estimation methods, the DNR estimates have never been weighed against real wolf populations for accuracy. That means we don't know if these estimates are true wolf numbers even within their wide ranges. The entire assumption about filling up occupied territories with the average pack sizes and multiplying it by the average pack numbers throughout a large range of Minnesota landscape has never been shown to actually tell us real wolf numbers. That means we don't know how many wolves live in the wild. That means we have no clue about the state of genetic diversity in the wild wolf population. A statistical wolf estimate and relying simply on unreliable wolf numbers is not good enough. We need to treat them like the threatened species they are. We need to shatter this illusion and talk about how to truly protect the wolf.
So there you have it. That's our view of the process. I would just like to add one more point, and that is over the last...
Our Fox 9 series on Wolf Week. Last night, we took you to the International Wolf...
No, I don't work for them. One of the things that we discovered in looking at this data in great detail is that for the last 2 years of the population survey, approximately 50% of the wolves that are used to make this computation of the pack's territory were either dead or missing by the end of the period. So with that in mind, I think we have a lot to learn. As Mr. Stark just told you, it took 40 years for the population to double. And as Representative Fischer told you, it took only 1 year of a hunt to reduce it by 25%. Thank you.
Thanks for your testimony. Would like to go to the end if we can, please? We get everybody in here. We're trying to, and testifiers, if you can keep it to 2 minutes or very close to that, please.
2 minutes.
I apologize, but we've got another bill yet to hear.
Okay. Hi,
Introduce yourself, please.
I'm Maureen Hackett, and I founded Howling for Wolves. Thank you, Chairman Purcell, for allowing us to talk today about this important issue. Really appreciate the time. And I'm going to try and decipher things down. Obviously, I've been working on this a long time, so 2 minutes is a little challenging. If I could ask for maybe 3.5, that would be great. Anyway, we formed as a group when the first wolf hunt was talked about, because the first wolf hunt occurred even though we had a law a year prior to the wolf being removed from the endangered species list. We had a law that required a moratorium on wolf hunting, which was never put into place, even though it was promised for over 10 years. And that was part of the impetus to form Howling for Wolves. We are here to increase tolerance, to support better policies and plans to protect the wolf, and to basically allow the wolf to exist. Wolf hunting, as has been stated before, is not livestock wolf conflict management. We have separate programs for that. We know that farmers have some problems, but not many, but that is separate from a wolf hunt. We know for sure that a wolf hunt creates unintended consequences for farmers. And we also know that a wolf hunt creates unintended consequences for us as a human society. We found that a wolf hunt is different. First of all, we annihilated the wolves. Historically, we annihilated them. We didn't have wolf hunting. We had wolf poisoning, basically slaughters, and wiped out 99% of the wolf population. And now we're working with a very small, fragmented population, and we're expecting it to tolerate large numbers of kills for reducing what even further their social and genetic diversity. So people just need to understand that we don't know what the wolf can take. But we also know that in Minnesota, it's very deeply disrespectful and hurtful to many people to kill the wolf for fun. 79% of those who responded to a public comment, which was not listened to by the DNR, they're proposing another public comment, they didn't listen to the first one. 79% of an online survey of the people who responded said no to a wolf hunt, and that was before Howling for Wolves became an organization. And 79% in a poll, 600 random digit dial calls, said no, we want to protect the wolf as an asset for future generations. They agreed with that statement, 79%, an asset for future generations. We know that we need predators. We've learned in the last 100 years of our country we need predators. We have CWD brewing, and we know chronic wasting disease can go into primates. It already has. It went into the squirrel monkeys. And that Michael Osterholm has even testified that it's only a matter of time before chronic wasting disease goes into humans. So we know that we need all the assets we can get, and wolves, like mountain lions, will preferentially cull out the sick CWD deer. We need for wild areas the wolf, but more importantly, for our pride as a state, We need the wolf to set us aside. I mean, we're the original state with the original wolf population that never went extinct, never. Our population, the entire country's population depends on our population. And that's why I think we can set ourselves aside as different and say, hey, you know what? We can come together, we can let the wolf exist, and we can figure out a way. You know, this is about tolerance. The wolf is different. I've never seen so much hate come out when we had a wolf hunt. I've never seen so much talk of poaching when we had a wolf hunt, and so much really mean behavior. So it's not like another hunt. And so having a wolf hunt confuses the public and has actually increased wolf hate.
Thank you for your testimony. Please introduce yourself for the record. And
my name's Barry Babcock. I live in northeastern Hubbard County. I made the 4.5-hour drive down here this morning, so I've been up since 3. I've got about 3 hours sleep last night. But I came down here because I feel my voice might be something that you may want to consider about the wolf. I've been an avid deer hunter up in that same country, that tri-county, where the tri-counties of Beltrami, Cass, and Hubbard meet. I've been hunting up there for over 50 years. While I kept my membership alive, I was a member of the Pope and Young Archery Club for taking 2 record book whitetail deer. My wife and I, the last 15 years, I've been living off the grid in a remote area in that part of the state. And before that, my wife and I were owner-operators of a small business. From the late 1990s into the early 2000s, I was asked by the Deep Portage Conservation Reserve and the Minnesota Deer Hunters Association to hold clinics there on ethical hunting and how to shoot a traditional bow that I use when I hunt. So I've got a little bit of a perspective on deer hunting. And I would like to note that with the wolves, their populations, I believe, are estimated to be 3,200 back in about 2004, 2005. That coincided at the same year when the DNR announced that our deer herd was the largest it ever been in history, 1.25 million deer. And since before that and since after that, there's been an estimated approximately 1 million whitetails in northern Minnesota, well, in the state. The whitetail population east of the Mississippi is 50 million. Deer are on the increase everywhere, even in northern Minnesota. During those same years when the wolf population was estimated at 320 and it was 1.25 million deer, the DNR was offering as many as 5 bonus tags. Besides your regular license, that means you could shoot 5 antlerless deer in 1 buck or doe. And I was filling my freezer with deer. I was going out with my bow and taking deer early in the season, yearlings and fawns, and putting them in the freezer. This is a deer herd. We're in the golden age of deer hunting right now in northern Minnesota. I hear the Minnesota Deer Hunters Association, I read an article where they said that their members can't compete with wolves. When I'm hunting, there's areas I've found, like a neighbor who has a very manicured hayfield, lush with red clover. When it's been a lot excess moisture in the spring, the deer will be hunkered down in there in October and November. They won't move. It's all private property, and my deer hunting's kind of gone dead on my own private property and the adjacent county lands. I got up at night once at 1 in the morning and went out, and I could hear wolves howling from the northwest coming from this hayfield. The next day I went out and got on my tree stand and got a nice buck and saw about 6 or 7 deer. The wolves moved them out. Just like game populations have to adapt to wolves, like elk and deer, so do hunters have to adapt. I actually see the wolves as an asset for bow hunters, because does and fawns, they're not moving all around. It's all about food, and they'll hunker down in a woods of oaks where there's a bumper mass crop or in some lush hayfield, and they're hard to move. You get wolves in the area, and they're going to move them out, so they're really an asset to bow hunters. I would also like to say that when the hunting season opened up, most of my neighbors and even the livestock people, and I don't want my neighbors losing a cow or a calf to a deer. They're good people, they're good friends, and I don't want it. If it happens, I want them compensated. But they've never lost. My neighbor has 50 cows, and he had 26 calves. That's been about his population of his herd for the last 15, 20 years. He has not lost one yet. He brings all of his cows into his yard during the spring season when they're calving. And, I mean, you can talk to him. I mean, he's not a wolf advocate or a wolf lover, but it's a non-issue with him. Most of the farmers, small farmers around me, it is a non-issue. Most of the deer hunters a non-issue, but there's a segment when the wolves were delisted that opened up a Pandora's box. The legislature had reclassified the wolf from a big game animal to a small game animal. I believe it was a 2011 or 2012. I watched it on YouTube. That means the maximum penalty for violating, the wolf being, that still is today, unless it's been changed, and to my knowledge it hasn't, is still a small game animal with a maximum of a $500 fine. If the wolf was a big animal, I don't know what the maximum penalty is, but I know of hunters who've had their guns, vehicles, and licenses taken from them for violations. This has emboldened a small segment of the deer hunting population to rain havoc on wolves, killing them on sight when they can. What used to be the 3 S's, shoot, shovel, and shut up, is now shoot them in the gut, and they'll run off and die somewhere else. And my time up?
Please, yeah, wait, wrap it up, please.
One quick comment. When we were at the motel, we were cleaning rooms, this business we owned, and it had TV on. And there was a guy, they were hauling off dead wolves. It was an old 8mm film. It looked like it could have been in northern Minnesota. And they had wolves piled on their back, loading them on the wagon like cordwood. And I saw one of the wolves, a big male, wasn't dead yet. He was paralyzed. He raised his head and looked around. I think that as a hunter, we don't need to hunt everything. We've got plenty enough animals in this country to hunt without hunting an icon of Minnesota, the wolf. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Babcock.
Next, I believe we have Sandy Skinaway. Okay. Thank you, Sandy.
Hey, please. Introduce yourself for the record, please, and proceed.
Thank you, Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Sandra Skinaway, and I'm a tribal member of the Sandy Lake Band of Mississippi Ojibwe and McGregor, Minnesota. The Anishinaabe Ojibwe people of Minnesota continue to oppose the removal of federal protections for the gray wolf, a congressional act, or administratively by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I have tribal resolutions that oppose the recreational trophy wolf hunts and the removal of protections for the gray wolf. In the Anishinaabe creation story, we are taught that Mayangan, the wolf, is a brother to original man, the Anishinaabe. The Creator tasked them to travel throughout the earth and name everything. Once his task was completed, the Creator told the wolf and original man they had to take separate paths, but said that what happened to one would happen to the other, and that each would be feared, disrespected, and misunderstood by the people that would later join them on this earth. We believe that we lead parallel lives with the wolf, as we have experienced the same fates to this day. We have had our lands taken, and we both occupy a fraction of our historic lands. Because of this, we also have historical traumas because of what happened in the past. Wolves naturally fear humans and tend to shy away from human contact. And I believe it's because of the historical trauma that they have experienced over years of being hunted and killed. The wolf has an important and critical role in our ecosystem. Wolves maintain a delicate balance of the land and for other wildlife whose habitat depends on the wolf for vegetation growth. The wolf also brings millions of tourism dollars to local economies. The recreational wolf trophy hunt sanctioned by the state of Minnesota began in 2012 due to politics, not science. These recreational trophy hunts are very disrespectful and dishonorable, as it allows the harassment, intimidation, and the bullying of these majestic spiritual animals before they are massacred without mercy, all in the name of management. There was a study at the Washington State University which found that these trophy hunts cause more predation on livestock by the surviving wolves because of the human killing of wolves disrupted wolf packs, which created conflicts for the remaining wolves the following year. Killing wolves to prevent them from preying on livestock is not based on sound science. Utilizing non-lethal methods such as the use of guard animals, fences, flagery, also known as flagging, lights and carcass removal can effectively reduce wolf livestock conflicts. Please consider supporting the passage of House File 1327, the bill prohibiting open season for taking wolves. If I may ask, Chairman, we testified on a wolf informational hearing back in January 2014, and which a lot of us are testifying again today. Dan Stark mentioned that they were working on an informational brochure on the wolf, on how to avoid conflicts, and I was wondering if did you ever complete that?
We can ask them to provide that at some point, if you will. We'll take that question under advisement and ask them to give us further information on that.
Okay, because I know they do have one on the bear. I mean, I used to work for the DNR many years ago, and we had brochures on how to live with bears. And I really would appreciate it if they can also have a brochure on how to live with wolves.
We'll get that information from them if they haven't, and if they have it, and get some feedback from them. I would like to proceed to other testifiers, though.
Okay, well, thank you, Chairman, Committee.
Thank you.
That's the testifiers that I'm aware of on our side. There may be, if there's,
Do we have other testifiers?
yeah, there's other testifiers, all right.
Yep, no.
I'm not sure who they all are.
We're going to keep going and get everybody we can here. Please introduce yourself and proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Corey Bennett, representing the Minnesota Deer Hunters Association. I will be brief, Mr. Chairman, to try to do my part to get you to session and so that you do not have to come back this evening. I can always follow up with all of you a little bit later if need be. So I just wanted to mention that Minnesota Deer Hunters Association strongly supports current law. For several years, Minnesota had an effective wolf managing program through conservation plan and providing hunting and livestock depredation control, while also maintaining a healthy wolf population. We've been a bit through a moratorium at this point right now. However, the Minnesota Deer Hunters Association strongly supports the efforts at the federal level with regards to delisting the wolf yet once again. By all reasonable measures, particularly those provided by the Endangered Species Act, the wolf has recovered in the state of Minnesota. A federal recovery plan for the gray wolf identified recovering populations of 1,251 to 1,400 wolves. Minnesota's management plan calls for a population of at least 1,600 wolves. The Minnesota Department of Natural Resources wolf estimates are at 2,655 wolves, 465 packs, and that was in the winter of 2017 to 2018, and those numbers have been steady. Because the gray wolf has surpassed all recovery goals in Minnesota, and the DNR has shown it can effectively manage wolves in the state, MDHA strongly supports the return of the gray wolf to the state of Minnesota and to the state of for Minnesota's management. I want to point out, Mr. Chairman, that the Deer Hunters Association is not anti-wolf, but we do believe that the wolf population, along with other species, should be managed appropriately so we have a proper balance out there on the landscape. So with that, Mr. Chairman, Minnesota Deer Hunters Association strongly supports the current wolf management plan. Thank you, sir.
Thanks for your testimony. Please introduce yourself and proceed.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, for the record, my name is Josie Linetti, Associate Director of Public Policy with the Minnesota Farm Bureau. The Minnesota Farm Bureau represents nearly 30,000 farm and ranch families across all of Minnesota, and many family farms are impacted by the wolf situation. Along with me today, and I believe it was passed out, is a letter from two individuals on serving on Minnesota Farm Bureau's Board of Directors, so they wanted to include their comments. In the interest of time, I asked you read the letter when you've got some time, and I'd like to just read a snippet of it. Miles Cushel, who farms in Cass County, is unable to be with us today as he's on his ranch taking care of his cows as he is in calving season. And Shane Isney is out in Washington, D.C. meeting with the USDA, and his brother is taking care of the beginning of calving season on their farm up in Roseau County. Minnesota Farm Bureau is opposed to House File 1327 that would prohibit an open season for wolves. The wolf has directly impacted many family farms, and both Miles and Shane have personally lost many cows and calves to wolf attacks and have seen the emotional and physical tolls that it takes on surviving animals. We're simply asking that if and when the animal is taken off the Endangered Species Act due to more than sufficient population numbers, the state government has options at hand to adequately protect the wolf animal while still managing other considerations. The current statute does not call for a statewide hunt, but allows the proper discussions to happen on how the state should best manage the wolf population. As farmers and ranchers, caring for our animals is a top priority, especially during this time of year as we care for animals as they give birth. Again, I'll wrap it up and be brief, Mr. Chair. Thank you for allowing us to participate in this informational hearing.
Thank you for your testimony. Please introduce yourself and proceed.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members. Tim Spreck today speaking for the interests of all the organized trappers in the state of Minnesota, both the Minnesota Trappers Association and the Minnesota Forest Zone Trappers. I think the most important message that I could bring to the committee today is that we're not looking at anywhere near the type of practices that people were looking at 50 years ago. We understand that a viable and healthy wolf population in Minnesota is very important. However, we do need to also understand that this is a top predator and as such needs to have management. The DNR has proven over the years, going back to the framing of the original, or not the original, but the last hunt in the early 2010s, that they can do an excellent job, and they have done an excellent job. And I think that having the ability to institute a wolf-taking season again, if it becomes delisted, is very important. And the removal of this statutory language removes that option. It doesn't mean that we have to have a hunt, but it gives us the option to go ahead and do so to manage wolves for numbers. I deal with a lot of folks in the northern half of the state as constituents of my lobbying operation, and I hear time and time again, whether it's from a fishing group or a trapping group or any other group, that wolves are on the landscape in numbers that are very large compared to what they've been historically. It is a problem, it is a burden, and we need to have the option to manage these animals effectively and respectfully. And with that, Mr. Chair, I thank you for the time.
Thank you for your testimony. Is there anyone in the audience that is looking to testify on this bill? I don't see anybody coming up here. Representative, I do want to get Representative Sanstede's bill here, so Representative Fischer, just being informational and all, do you have anything? Well,
No.
See, Representative Fabian? No? Okay.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to say thank you to the committee for the opportunity to present the bill. While this is informational, I think some of the things that is very important for us to keep in mind is what we're just talking about is the open season and taking that off the table. We've heard different people talking about making sure that we have a management plan occurring, and I think there's ways to manage the wolf population where there's conflicts in a way that does not involve the open season. And so therefore, a lot of people in Minnesota feel strongly on that. We'd like to continue the opportunity to be able to have the discussion and move this bill forward at some point in time. So I'd like to say thank you to the committee. Any final questions?
I did see, I had Representative Luke on the page here, and I didn't see it, so please.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, and I know we've got another very important bill ahead of us here that we need to get to, but one, I'd like to make sure that everybody recognizes there's also a letter in everybody's package here from the Minnesota State Cattlemen's Association and past President Tim Nolte. Like Mr. Kushel is out there protecting his livestock from wolves right now in the calving season, so he's not able to be here to testify. But one of the things, and again, we don't obviously have time here, but there were a number of things that were stated here. One kind of poo-pooed the status from a state law enforcement perspective of how much trouble you would be in if you injured a wolf illegally, obviously. And so I just would urge the audience here to be cautious because believe me, the state of Minnesota has got some intense, tough penalties in addition to the federal penalties if you in any way step outside of the law. And the idea that it's treated like maybe hitting a squirrel in the road is just completely wrong. So that's one, we got to just make sure, Mr. Chair, that we have a little absolute honesty here and not lead people to believe that it would be no big deal. And somehow the DNR has downgraded what they would do if they caught you illegally injuring or killing a wolf. And again, in the interest of time here to get on to the next bill, there was a tremendous amount of information that was put out here. The DNR at some point in time, maybe after we get through some of these deadlines, needs to be able to come back and set the record straight, because honest to goodness, there is a huge amount of absolutely tight data going back to when Dave Meach was out there as a young graduate student trying to figure out what to do with wolves. And we need to set the record straight here. But with that, Mr. Chair, we need to get on to Representative Sanstede's bill here, because that's a very important matter.
Thank you for that, Representative Luke, and I'll get to Representative Fabian. I want to say real quick, with the author's permission, they're talking about a letter, we can post letters, et cetera, on our committee website. So if we get permission, and they've been handed out, I assume we have permission if we got them in our possession. So we can do that. Representative Fabian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Real quickly, if DNR could provide that information to the committee members via email, the statistics and the numbers associated with penalties and so forth, that may be helpful going into another conversation. And one other thing, I've heard when Representative Lewick was talking about one of his constituents being home taking care of his cattle, I heard some noises coming from behind me. If people want to see some pictures of what wolves do to calves and so forth, I've got them right here. Thank you.
And with that, and I'm going to ask the DNR too, we had a question from a testifier regarding information the DNR was going to prepare. So if you would send us some, by email is fine, to get us that information, and then we'll put it on the committee website. So all of that's going there. Representative Fischer, last final words, if you would.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Committee, I just want to reemphasize is that if we want to really help protect our farmers going forward, actually the wolf hunt is the last thing we want to have happen. When it happened before, we saw the wolf population go down, but we saw the incidence of conflict go up. And so as a result, I would say one of the best ways to prevent problems in farm country is also to help make sure that we don't have a open season. So thank you for the time, and I appreciate the opportunity to present today.
Thank you for bringing the bill. It's good to talk about these things. And Representative Sanstede, informational hearing on House File 2383, school trust lands. Please tell us about your bill.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members. House File 2383 is a bill that deals with the duties of the School Trust Land Director and the Office of School Trust Lands. This bill clarifies the basis for removal of the director, establishes an oath of office in relation to the director's fiduciary duty owned to the school trust, reorganizes the director's job duties in the statute, provides continuity to the Office of School Trust Lands, and aims to extend 2 prior appropriations that expire on June 30th, 2019. By way of background, school trust lands granted to the state by federal government in 1858 were set aside to provide a continual source of funding for public education and are managed in a way that generates revenue for the permanent school fund. Interest and dividends from the fund are distributed to every public school district within the state. The legislature established the School Trust Land Director position in 2012 as an advisor to the executive branch and the legislative branch. At the same time, the legislature created the Legislative Permanent School Fund Commission consisting of 6 representatives and 6 senators. I am one of the DFL House members appointed to this commission. The Legislative Permanent School Fund Commission discussed this bill at its last meeting, March 11th of 2019. All members at that meeting agreed the Permanent School Fund Commission members should advance this initiative. I'm hopeful that the changes outlined in this bill will, over time, aid the Director and the Office of School Trust Lands' efforts to increase revenue for the Permanent School Fund, and by doing so, will strengthen education opportunities for all of Minnesota students. And I'd appreciate support.
Representative Sanstede, it looks like you have a testifier.
Here to answer questions if we have questions.
Representative Lewitt.
Actually, I don't have any direct questions, but I'm also a member of the Permanent Trust Commission and with Representative Sanstede, and we did go over this in great detail. We're in a kind of an evolutionary process in dealing with with the DNR manages literally all of that land from one perspective. We've got the Director of School Trust Funds office that's an integral part of that. And we've just been step by step making adjustments in the relationships and really important, the relationship with the Permanent School Trust Commission, because we're kind of on the outside looking in. There's some of us that believe that should become a legitimate permanent committee, joint committee, not commission, committee, within the legislature, so that bills that deal with this type of stuff would come through with real amending authority, real referral authority, those types of things. These are modest steps, and I believe we got members from the DNR. They may want to comment. There's really this is something that really needs to be done. It shouldn't be an informational hearing. It ought to be going to the general register, as far as I'm concerned. But I just want to thank Representative Sanstede for this. And we got to remember, we're talking about property that belongs to the school kids, despite what most people might think. It's not just plain old public land. It's land that was set aside very specifically by our, first as a territory and then ensconced in our state constitution. The purpose of those properties is to generate revenue to fund K-12 education. And we continue to make progress in increasing the amount of funding we can do every year. And that's through forestry, it's through mining, it's through leasing, gravel sales, all kinds of different things that comes off that land. But again, I say no specific questions, but I don't know if the DNR wanted to comment also, because they're also a integral part of this process, along with the school trust lands director.
I will ask if there are any members of the public who would wish to testify for or against this bill. Assistant Commissioner Meyer.
Mr. Chairman, members of the record, Bob Meyer, Assistant Commissioner of the DNR, and thank you to Representative Sanstede and Representative Lewitt for supporting this bill. We have been working with OSTL on this language. The appropriation pieces in particular are important to keep moving, to continue the work that we are doing. And it is a new day in trust fund management between the DNR and the OSTL, and we're very excited to be where we're at and look forward to providing additional benefits to the Permanent School Trust Fund into the future.
Representative Wagenius.
Just looking at the language, and on line 1.14, that folks would tolerate gross negligence surprises me no end. I just will make that comment. And I don't know of any place else in state statute where we make people swear, and it would be curious to find out if that is the case. I don't know of that. So.
Assistant Commissioner Meyer, you want to go on
Madam
a shot?
Chair, members, just briefly, this position does exist in the executive branch, so there is, it's a unique kind of a hybrid position, but I believe, at least I haven't had any conversations with the governor's office on this language, so I think that would be one next step on this provision, talking about cause, to see where that moves forward. But the rest of the bill, I think, is just clarification and recodification, so we can make sure that those conversations happen.
Additional discussion, members, remaining members? All right, Representative, you want any closing words on your bill?
I would like to say thank you to the other authors on this bill. This is a bipartisan lift, and I do think it's important that we continue working on this. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your patience today. And with that, we are adjourned.